Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm reviewing Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and it's really a very good read. I'll start by giving you a bit of background into where I came across the text. So I'm reading this in a tradition of understanding Black history through primary sources. So this would start with Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth in the slavery era. So here's what slavery looks like in America. I've been a slave. Let me tell you how it is. And then this develops during the time of Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois. So post war between the states. And how do we make a life together when, as a society, when one of us was enslaved for many, many years? And those two didn't agree with that. And then a third voice you could add would be Marcus Garvey as part of the Back to Africa movement, who you could say also agreed with Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was a Back to Africa person as well, that, look, we can't live together. Let's just go our separate ways. So Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Marcus Garvey all represent different voices within the Black community for how to deal with this problem now. And you could say after 1850, after 1865, after 1876. Then James Baldwin, who wrote a book called The Fire Next Time, which is clearly the literary inspiration for this text, is a book that is seething with anger because in his mind, he writes this in the 60s, this is effectively 100 years later, and the open question in that text is, why is it still this way? And so if you read this book in that tradition and you get to 2016 and you read it, it's a very logical end of that journey. And when I say at the end of the journey, I don't mean that Blacks are done reflecting on what their story is in America, but I'm saying that Coates's entire tone he takes is one of sad resignation. He's not lying down and saying there's nothing we can do about it, but he's recognized that there are forces beyond his control and that simply writing about injustice is not going to change things. And I think that that's a very sober and realistic approach. And that adds a patina of sadness to the text itself because you're reading his own resignation. And this is a letter to his son. So Baldwin in The Fire Next Time was writing a letter to his nephew. And you could say it was more militant. But this same framing device works very well for Coates because there are more updated things. So, for example, Baldwin was talking about Louis Farrakhan in the Nation of Islam, which was more ascendant in that time period, and nobody really knows or cares about them anymore. And here he's talking about Michael Brown and some of the other injustices and challenges that have happened within the United States in these past years. And so being framed as a letter to his own son, it's free to be very personal, but it also allows him to dip in and out of cultural events, cultural figures, and give us those references. And there's one particular passage which I found very moving. And to give you some background, this is in reference to a man named Prince Jones, a 25-year-old fellow Howard alum who was making his way in the world and was mistakenly identified, even though there's no explanation of how he was mistakenly identified, and was shot by a Black police officer just outside his fiance's house. And just one more act of senseless violence within the frame of the Black experience in America. But the way that Coates puts this is astonishing. And so I'm just going to read it. It's a long passage, but I think it's worth reading, and I think it will give you a sense of the tone of what is being conveyed in this book. This isn't symptomatic. This isn't emblematic of everything that you're going to read in this book. It's just simply something that's really built up to. It's about 3/4 of the way in, and so it does build on your knowledge of what else he's been talking about in the book. But I think it still is worthwhile hearing, even as a standalone. And it occurred to me then that you would not escape, that there were awful men who'd laid plans for you, and I could not stop them. Prince Jones was the superlative of all my fears. And if he, good Christian, scion of a striving class, patron saint of the twice as good, could be forever bound, who then could not? And the plunder was not just of Prince alone. Think of all the love poured into him. Think of the tuitions for Montessori and music lessons. Think of the gasoline expended, the treads worn carting him to football games, basketball tournaments, and Little League. Think of the time spent regulating sleepovers. Think of the surprise birthday parties, the daycare, and the reference checks on babysitters. Think of World Book and Childcraft. Think of checks written for family photos. Think of credit cards charged for vacations. Think of soccer balls, science kits, chemistry sets, racetracks, and model trains. Think of all the embraces, all the private jokes, customs, greetings, names, dreams, all the shared knowledge and capacity of a black family injected into that vessel of flesh and bone. And think of how that vessel was taken, shattered on the concrete, and all its holy contents, all that had gone into him, sent flowing back to the earth. Think of your mother who had no father, and your grandmother who was abandoned by her father, and your grandfather who was left behind by his father. And think of how Prince's daughter was now drafted into those solemn ranks and deprived of her birthright, that vessel which was her father, which brimmed with 25 years of love and was the investment of her grandparents and was to be her legacy. Whew. So, as I started the video, I told you that for me, this book was at the end of a trajectory that started with Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth. But I realized in thinking about it and talking about it with others that it actually can be used the opposite way as well. You can use this book as an entry point to go backwards. So if you're not familiar with Black history in America, which I think is well worth becoming more familiar with, particularly if you're an American, or if you're interested in why America seems to be plagued by this problem to this day, it's worth reading as a starting point to go backwards and to go look at these authors. And when I say the problem that's in America today, only really half of the population seems to think that there is a race problem in America. The other just thinks it's all bad media or the press is making it up. And Coates says early on that this is simply not the case. In fact, let me find the page here so that the idea is that since America was created by God, here it is a profound question because America understands itself as God's handiwork, but the black body is the clearest evidence that America is the work of men. And it's not just talking about blacks. You can see how America dealt with the Native Americans and how we broke every treaty that we ever signed with Native Americans. And if your belief system says that America was created and designed by God, naturally any attack on America is not just an attack on your religion of America, but also on God. But since America wasn't designed by God, that's simply a fact, then you should be open to looking at the realities of history. So not just with blacks, not just in our fights with other colonial powers to try to establish this sea to shining sea empire, the way that we dealt with Native Americans, that reading this book is simply one subset of that whole larger problem, which was America was not designed by God, face up to the facts. This does not mean hate your country, hate America, America is the worst thing ever. It simply means that love, like anything, isn't straightforward. It isn't only roses. There are thorns, there are difficult chapters, and that's all part of the story as well. And the sooner that Americans can face up to the challenges of our history, the sooner that we can make progress towards doing anything about it. The first step in solving a problem is to recognize that there is indeed a problem. And people who think that the history of race relations in America is simply a conspiracy by the leftist media are simply uneducated about the issue. And that's okay, because you can take the time to be educated about the issue. Reading primary sources, people who've lived the experience, and if you don't trust a modern person, go back. Go back and read Frederick Douglass. Go back and read Sojourner Truth. Go back and read Booker T. Washington, founder of Tuskegee Institute. Go back and read W.B. Du Bois. And once you've read those people, then I think it'd be worthwhile listening to what you have to say about the Black experience in America. If you're not actually Black and you've experienced it yourself, someone like myself who has to read to get insights into that history. Until that time, anything that you have to say is simply just a poorly formed opinion. And that's why I think it's important to read these primary sources. So, Between the World and Me, Ta-Nehisi Coates, there's a link below to get this book if you'd like. If you want to see other videos like this, please feel free to subscribe and like this video. Hit your thumbs up if you enjoyed it. And I'll be back next time with another book review, which I do periodically for this channel. Thanks for watching.